Great. So, and this paper is very preliminary. I mean, we only had a draft a few months ago. We are kind of presenting it. We still haven't submitted it. So all your comments are greatly appreciated. Right. So a little bit of motivation. So violation of environmental regulation is a pervasive problem. There is recent work also that has studied how like firms kind of cheat the regulator, especially in environmental regulator, right, by polluting more. But most of these studies assume that that firms choose actions independently from other competitors. So they model this kind of game between the regulator and the firm as a single agent problem. However, there are some theory papers that look at how, in cases when the regulator has imperfect information, so how collusion among the agents is possible. Right? So the agents may talk to each other, may coordinate, so to avoid being detected or to lower the fines. However, there are very few empirical studies on this issue, and even in practice, in policy, so regulators, environmental regulators rarely consider collusion. So the regulator who actually punishes collusion is the antitrust authority. So in this paper, we're going to focus on a particular case of collusion among German manufacturers, sorry, German car makers, German car manufacturers. So in this case, the German manufacturers colluded not on price, but on a NOx emission control technology in response to emission regulation. So we are going to talk about diesel cars. So this is the, you can see here in the car, the system we are going to focus on. So in the back of the car, you see this a tank. So this tank is called the DEF tank. I'm gonna tell you in a few slides what all these acronyms mean. But just to fix ideas, so this system, the CEA system, requires a tank. So in order to pollute less, to emit less NOx, you need to have a bigger tank, right? But in this case, the car makers colluded to have smaller tanks, only these German manufacturers. And given that the regulator had imperfect information about the efficiency of the system, so it wasn't able to detect that the German cars were polluting more than what they actually said. Okay, so at the end, I mean, then if you know about the Dieselgate, right? So they caught Volkswagen cheating on emissions. So, and that led to an investigation on other car makers. So the European Commission opened an antitrust investigation against the main German car manufacturers, so BMW, Daimler, and Volkswagen in 2018. And then 1 year later, they released the statement of objections in which they accused the firms of restricting competition on emission clean technology. And the report said that in the Commission's preliminary review, BMW, Daimler, and Volkswagen coordinated their DEF AdBlue dosing strategies. The AdBlue is the liquid that is contained in the tank. So coordinated their AdBlue dosing strategies, AdBlue tank size, and refill ranges between 2006 and 2014. I'm gonna show you more quotes about this report later, but just to fix ideas again, so the European Commission is investigating these car makers for coordinating on this technology. The case is still ongoing, so everything that I'm going to say is about the alleged collusion, right? So,
Jorge, just a question. I don't really understand what's really the value of collusion here. I mean, it
that's
seems
amazing. No, it's a great question. That is actually how we started thinking about this paper, because it's not clear. So that's why we're going that's why we are going to have a model. So if you allow me,
sure.
I mean, I'm going to explain the case the modeling in more detail. But basically, what we're going to show is that collusion lowered the expected fines. So give me some slides.
Okay, sure.
Just to a clarification question. So it's basically what is punished here is the reporting or the technology. Is that they didn't say what was the actual level of contamination, or it was about they agreed on a certain technology.
Right. So they agreed on the size, right, of this tank. They reported the size of the tank, and also they reported an emission level, right? So the regulator had a standard, and obviously the emission levels reported was below those standards, right? But they can cheat. The car makers can cheat and actually cheated because the regulator didn't have the resources to examine every single car, right? And also because of these cheating devices. Again, I'm going to be more clear in the model, but basically these are the actions of the firms.
So they misreport on top of making an agreement on the size of the tank. Okay.
That's right, exactly.
Ronnie, that's in.
As far as I recall, in this case, the size of that thing is almost no cost, because making it a bit bigger means that you don't have to go that often to refill it. So that's the doesn't seem to be reasonable to collude on that unless there's some sort of standardization of the time periods in which you go to maintenance, because that's when I think you refill these things. So I don't really understand the object of colluding on this, or rather standardizing, because how do you differentiate that from standardization of something? So my point is that the standardization of these things perhaps is irrelevant because this thing works. I mean, the putting the liquid in the thing actually does reduce emissions of diesel vehicles. So it might be that they cheated on other things, but this particular thing seems more like a standardization thing. That's my
right. Yeah, it's a great question, and also like it was kind of like the first things that we started thinking about when we got to this case. So first of all, like I agree. I mean, even if you put like a small kind of a low dose of the liquid into the emissions, it works. But still, like most of the cars were non-compliant, so they polluted more than the standard. So that's one thing.
Right.
Second, we are going to see also empirically that actually even if maybe the marginal cost wasn't like much of having like larger tanks, it implies, I mean, the space in the car is limited. So if you have a big car, you need to compromise on other attributes of the car. Usually that attribute was the trunk space. So having a larger tank means having a smaller trunk, right? And consumers value the trunk space.
But how do you differentiate between standardization, in which you make things the same in many areas? You have the same seat belts, you have the same many other things from this.
Yeah, I don't think we have a clear answer. Like the best answer we can give is that collusion on a product attribute diminishes welfare, as opposed to standardization, which may increase welfare. So I think that this is the best answer we can give.
Right.
But you are going to see that, I mean, so we talk about collusion because you see the same effects that you see in price collusion. So, so what do we do in this paper? So, so first, kind of, we ask ourselves, so what is the difference between, so suppose the firm is non-complying. So what is the difference between unilaterally non-complying from jointly non-complying. So what is the added benefit of colluding with your competitors, right? In this case, where monitoring is costly, as I said before. So we are going to try to understand this this difference. So that's why we are going to have a theory model. And then in the second part, we are going to take this model basically to data. We are going to calculate what the expected fines, the expected costs that the firms had in mind when they thought of whether to join or not this agreement, this collusive agreement. And then we are going also to calculate to estimate the welfare consequences of this form of collusion. So I guess that's where we address Ronald's point about standardization. Right. So just to think, I mean, so why is this interesting? So when you have unilateral non-compliance, so the compliance cost goes down, right? Because you don't need to. This technology is costly for the car makers. Again, I mean, installing a bigger tank reduces the trunk space, and consumers don't like that. They want a large trunk, But on the other hand, they expect a penalty, right? So if they are caught cheating the regulator, then they're going to receive a penalty. When we have collusion on compliance, so there might be cost efficiencies. So there could be potentially a benefit that the firms work together, and this is kind of the benefit from standardization. But also, and this is again a question, the expected penalty can go down. And why can it go down? So we have several hypotheses. So one, and I'm also going to explain this in detail. So first, the chance of being caught can go down. So think that the regulator observes the behavior of firms. If all the firms adopted the same technology, then the regulator can say, okay, everybody is doing the same, so everybody's fine, right? So nobody attracts the regulator's attention. So that's one channel. A second channel is that all firms have skin in the game, so that nobody has an incentive to deviate. And finally, there is this diffusion of responsibility. So which means that all the firms jointly, all the firms prefer to be colluding in together, right, in cahoot together, as opposed to having one guy kind of complying. Because, or to put it differently, if you are the only guy cheating and then you get a fine, then consumers can punish you more heavily than if all the other firms are in non-compliance. Right? So I'm also going to show you some empirical evidence on this channel. So what is the methodology in the paper? So first, we're going to have a model where we look at firms' profits, firm behavior, either in non-compliance, in unilateral non-compliance and in joint non-compliance. Like one of the main contributions of this paper is that from the model, we're able to construct inequalities that are going to provide a bound on the non-compliance penalties. So we're going to have an estimate of how much the firms benefit from jointly non-complying. And the model also gives us a welfare benchmark. And then we take this part of the model to the data, we estimate the demand for the cars, we look at the behavior with respect to prices, with respect to profits, and then we quantify the size of these bounds, and we also quantify the welfare effects. And just as in parentheses, so we use the term collusion, but we are going to focus mainly on the participation incentives to join the cartel, and not really on the incentives to kind of the dynamic incentives to deviate or not from the cartel. So we're going to think what firms kind of thought or calculated before the cartel. Okay. So this is in a nutshell the paper. So what do we find? So we find that less compliant emission control technology frees up trunk space. So this is what I told you before, and also also lowers the marginal cost. So even installing a small tank lowers the marginal cost of the car. And this estimate goes in line with those that we found in the literature, in the technical literature. Second, we failed to find any cost efficiencies from collusion. So that was the first channel I told you. But we do find that collusion reduces the expected non-compliance penalties. We also find that, and this is an interesting point, that collusion increases profits of the cars, of car makers, and also it increases the buyer surplus. And why is this? Because collusion frees up trunk space, right? That was the first part. So cars that pollute more have a larger trunk space, and consumers value that. But the part that is negative and that reduces welfare is the increased NOx damages, right? Increased pollution. And this, the third part, the third effect, is going to be dominant. So we find that the welfare loss is between 1 and 7 billion euros, depending on what you think that compliance is. And this is fairly large. If you can compare this figure with the top 3 antitrust fines in the EU that have all gone to Google, that are in the range of 1.5 to 4 billion euros. So this is fairly large.
Jorge, yeah. But they're not only antitrust fines, but at least in the United States, the firms got punished with they had to pay back to the owners. They had to, because of the reduced value or the resale value of the cars and things like that. And that's not included in the argument. Sometimes you have consumers suing in aggregate, and that can be much more costlier than fines.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, the thing is, in the EU, the environmental regulation is kind of fragmented among the different countries. So the most effective authority is the European Commission, and the European Commission mostly deals with antitrust. The case is not finished yet, so we are not able yet to go into the details of what the European Commission has in mind, but it's going to be largely an antitrust case that includes these pollution damages.
But this calculation the firms do, does it include the possibility that they have to compensate owners, which could become much larger an amount than the fines?
In principle, no. So it does. Our calculation does, because it is so our bound is a measure of the least amount of money that the firms were thinking when they got into the cartel, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be profitable. So that's how we get these bounds. Right. So briefly on the literature. So we think that our paper contributes to 3 strands of the literature. First, there are some papers of agents colluding against the principal, against the regulator. This paper provides the first empirical application of these papers. Then there is a literature on regulatory enforcement and imperfect compliance with the regulation. We looked at collusion, right? At what happens when firms collude against against regulation. And finally, there is a growing literature on collusion on characteristics other than price or quantities. So I myself have a recent paper on this literature, and a co-author of mine, Matthias, has contributed to this second strand of the literature. Right. So let's get into the case. So let me tell you. So first, I'm going to tell you a bit on the data and some descriptive evidence. Then I'm going to tell you how we are thinking theoretically on the case. Then we're going to take the model to the data. So I'm going to present you how we do this and how we estimate the model. And finally, I'm going to show you the welfare, how we think about welfare. And then I will conclude. Right. So we are studying the German car industry. So we are going to call the German car makers as the working group because they really work together on the second point. Actually, they have hundreds of joint groups in which in which they work on different technological attributes, and that's why at the beginning, like also for us, it was so difficult to separate collusion from standardization. So this is one part. So collusion was carried out by one particular group, such group. Then just to tell you, I mean, so we are going to study these 3 car makers that actually manufacture lots of different brands. So in Europe, they have a joint market share of almost 50% in 2014. And in Germany, they have a market share of almost 70%. And also, these car makers are seen as more substitutes with each other. We're going also to check this on our data. But this is going to drive many of the effects that we find. So that was the industry. Then let me tell you about the regulation. So this graph shows the increasing or more stringent standards both in the US in gray and in Europe in orange over time. We're going to focus on Euro 6, which is this last part. So that started in 2014. If you remember, the case said that the firm started coordinating in 2006. And that is because the car maker starts working on a car many years in advance, right? So they started working on the cars that were going to be released in 2014, around 2016, 2010, throughout this period. Right, and you see also how stringent, quote unquote stringent, the standards have become in recent years, as opposed to the early 90s. Right. So we are going to focus on a emission control technology of NOx for diesel vehicles. Right? So there are 2 main technologies to reduce NOx. So one is the lean NOx trap, LNT, which is used mostly in small cars. And then the technology we are going to focus on is the SCR, the selective catalytic reduction, which uses a tank of this fluid, the diesel exhaust fluid, the DEF, that can scale with the vehicle size. So that's why if you have a large vehicle, you can install a large tank that is going to reduce your emissions almost to 0. So the DF tanks were originally designed to last a whole year. This is what user manuals say. We didn't find any evidence that said otherwise. Only after of all these recent scandals, the car makers have started to tell consumers that they may have to refill the DEF tank more than once a year. So we have the tank that we measure in liters, and we are also going to work, and mainly we are going to work with a dosage, which we calculate as the percent of the tank size divided by the annual fuel consumption. So if we assume that the tank lasts for a whole year, so we are going to calculate what is the dosage needed to achieve whatever pollution level you need. So this is one of my co-authors' car. So she bought a 10-liter tank of DF. This is a 10-liter box, right? So and you can see that this 10 liters is not insignificant, right? So it does take space of the car. Now, what happened with respect to collusion? So already in 2006, the car makers, the working group, started talking about the how to design cars for the Euro 6 standards. And there are lots of interesting quotes that we found in the report. So the car maker said that, so in parentheses, the European Commission had access to all the reports that the car makers had in the meetings among them. So they wrote that it was absurd to have to have tanks of different sizes, and they needed a coordinated approach. So the target size of the tanks should be between 17 and 23 liters. We're going to see that they actually agreed on something much smaller. Then they also mentioned the urgent need for cooperation among the companies, and kind of what are the benefits of small tanks, that it was weight light, the smaller tanks didn't cost much, and also tellingly, smaller tanks left enough space for golf bags in the trunk. So consumers value a trunk size large enough to carry your golf bags. And they also warned against any other company going alone to avoid at all costs an arms race with regard to tank sizes. So this is all kind of the same things. I mean, this resonates as the same kind of talk that you have in actual collusion cases, which I think is interesting. So this was before all these things happened, before the implementation of Euro 6. Then the Volkswagen Dieselgate blows up. The Euro 6 emission standards come into effect, right? And in 2018, the EC started investigating the coordination among the car makers. So then we are going to use data from several sources. We have data on the vehicle sales and prices from JATO on the largest markets in Europe. Then we have vehicle characteristics from a German automobile association. And then recently we got some other data set on actual emissions. So we know that the car makers lied on emissions. So there was a company that tested around 1,000 models between 2011 and 2010. So we are going to be able to compare these 1,000 models between our data, our characteristics data, and this of real emissions data. Right. So in this plot, I showed you the difference of between the dosage of the working groups, so the German firms, and other firms in light gray. So you can see what happens over time. There may be some leader following dynamic going on. So we see that the working group, if you kind of believe this dynamic, you see that the working group signaled early on that they were going to adopt a low dosage. So remember, low dosage means low tank. And then you see like the other firms also kind of adopting a small tank. What else? And also the compliance level is between 2 and 3%. So you can see that most cars are really polluting more, right? So they are indeed using less of this DF fluid than they should. Right. This is another table. It shows the distribution between these real emissions and what the firms actually and the tank. So what I want you to focus on is basically the last column. So this is the percent of non-compliant cars. So I mean, so we actually don't know what the compliance level is. I told you between 2 and 3%. The regulator also doesn't know this, right? So the regulator has less information than car makers themselves. So what we do is we compare what we have in our database with respect to tank sizes and the matched cars for this other data set for which we have the size and also we know the pollution. So if you assume a 2%, so what we see in that other, in these kind of real driving emissions data set, 73% of the cars are non-compliant. If you assume a 2% dosage, then in the main data set, 66% of the cars are are non-compliant. If you think it's 3%, then almost all the cars are non-compliant. So we are not going to take a stance. We're just going to say between 2 and 3%. And I'm going to show you numbers for both, mostly focusing on 3%. All right, so this was a little bit on the data, some descriptive evidence. So let me tell you how about the model. So this is going to be a simple model of how the car makers, what the car makers thought when they went into collusion. So, and the environmental regulation takes two phases. So this is, imagine, I mean, this is in 2006, so way before the standard came into place. So the car makers started to think about how to design the cars. So they design the cars and they think about reporting. So they go to the regulator and they report an emission standard. So the firms can hide what they actually pollute, right? And in the second phase, there is going to be surveillance. So surveillance means that the regulator, with some probability, can investigate whether the reported emission level is actually what the firms reported, right? And if the regulator finds that the car makers are in non-compliance, then they give a fine. Then they can give either an environmental fine if they find the car makers in non-compliance, and they also can give an antitrust fine if the car makers were colluding. Okay, I think I said all the other points. So let me move on and go into the details. So the first phase, reporting. So there's going to be some notation. I hope, I mean, you're not going to have to remember it. So think about that. So when a firm F sells a car, right? So that car emits some externality, right? Some pollution. So that pollution is going to be EF. The firm or the car in the model is going to be the same. So the firm F has a true pollution that it emits. And then the firm also chooses the abatement, right? So for example, the firm can choose a perfect abatement. So can choose not that the emission is going to be 0 if AF is exactly theta F, right? Then the regulator sets a pollution standard. So it says that car makers cannot pollute more than an E star. So only cars that have that report an emission lower than E star can enter into the market. There is imperfect information, so the regulator doesn't observe a theta F. And then the firms report, I mean, they can cheat, right? So they can report an E that is lower than the actual EF. And so they can lie, right, when they report their emissions. So this is the first phase. Then in the second phase, the regulator observes the distribution of this car characteristic A, of the level of abatement. And it chooses to inspect a firm with some probability, right? So for example, you can imagine that the regulator chooses to inspect if the distribution looks suspicious, or if a car maker has a suspicious abatement level. And if so, it investigates and it issues a fine K, if the firm is found in non-compliance.
Jorge,
yeah.
What will be your prior of what is a suspicious distribution? Should we expect a lot of dispersion or not? Not clear to me.
So, no, it's not clear. We are not going to model this K or this expected K precisely because we don't know the shape of that function. I'm going to show you some evidence from the data of what can be suspicious, and then you can decide whether it is actually suspicious or not. But we're going to remain agnostic about that.
But that is going to be driven by the regulation, right? So I expect if it's costly, I expect always to be everything clustered at the regulation threshold, right?
Right. So what I'm going to show you is what happens if all the firms are in compliance of the regulation. So suppose if all the firms use a dose that is 2% or 3%, and only one firm has a non-compliance standard or the standard that actually they chose in reality. And you're going to see that the distribution of the firm is really an outlier. So it looks very different from the distribution of all the other compliant cars. Okay.
Yeah, but if that outlier exists, does this car maker make a unilateral profitable deviation? Because here consumers didn't like it, it's costly. So like being a good citizen only benefits the environmental agencies, but nobody else, right?
That's right. I mean, it also exactly it hurts your competitors, right? Because you steal market share from them. So you are right. That's right. That's why, I mean, that's why they colluded. I mean, it was profitable for them to collude, even despite the fine. Any more questions? Yes. Right. So this is the what happens, like the two stages, the two phases. So let's think about what the firm's decision process is like. So the firms observe the data, they observe their own types, they observe the regulation and the demand and their own costs. They also observe, then, they choose an abatement level, so F, and they report their EF, right, unilaterally, and the working group can coordinate or may coordinate their abatement levels, right? And then they also report an emission level, and then the firms compete in prices. So this is, it could sound strange, but this is a case of semi-collusion. So firms, there is no evidence that firms coordinated on prices. And this is why, and we think it is because, so lawyers actually reviewed all these notes that the working groups take. So they were, we think, very kind of specific in prices, but they were not thinking about collusion on other dimensions. I think this is similar, I mean, on another scale. So to the other paper, to my other paper I mentioned in the literature review. So that was a case of collusion on networks of doctors. So the physicians actually were not really thinking that coordinating on a network was illegal. So that's why, I mean, and in the model, we're going to take prices as given. In the empirics, we're going to assume that prices were chosen competitively. Right, and finally, firms collect, so in equilibrium, firms collect the variable profits and they pay a penalty with some probability if they're inspected. Okay, so what are the firms? Yeah,
Jorge, But what I find interesting is that the firms could have all colluded on a bigger thing that leaves less space for trunk space. Since they're all doing the same thing, there's no competitive effect amongst them, and they would have complied with the regulation. So there's something that I miss in the argument.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's a good point. So think of the abatement as something that consumers don't value. So, for example, I mean, just to make up something, if the firms would have colluded on engine size, right? Obviously, having a smaller engine affects the performance of the cars. So consumers value having a large engine. So this is purely an externality. This is something that consumers don't want, and as implication, also firms don't want. So it's only something that the regulator obliges firms to install. And in top of that, the firms don't have, or if there is only a probability that they're going to be inspected, then the firms kind of felt that it was optimal for them to cheat. Okay. Great. So let me move a little bit quickly or quicker to reach the empirics. So, and I guess this is what I just said. So, like this derivative of phi of the firm's profits with respect to the tank size is really negative, and it's negative because having a larger tank can potentially, and something we are going to look at, can potentially increase the marginal cost. And also, sorry, this is the second effect. And the first effect is decreases the willingness to pay of consumers, because consumers value the trunk space, which is the main kind of trade-off of having a large tank. So what happens with so then we study what happens without collusion. So actually I mean, you can think that firms that behave unilaterally so that they don't collude can either comply or not comply. We study the non-compliance in the paper. Here we show only the condition for compliance, which is this one. So the compliance level is this A star, right? And this is the compliance. So firms will comply only if the expected fine, EK, is large enough. Okay. So then what happens? I mean, when firms collude if even under this expected fine so this AC is the profile of tank sizes under collusion. So even if they get a fine in expectation, even if in expectation they get an antitrust fine, and if they earn more money, right, higher profits when they collude on the trunk space, if all these things together are higher than the profits they would make by complying, right? So this is the participation constraints for the firms. So from these inequalities, we reach the main proposition of the model, which is to say that under all those conditions, the expected non-compliance penalty under collusion must be lower than the penalty if the firms adopt AC unilaterally. So that this says that under all those assumptions, then the only role of collusion must be to lower the expected fine firms get. Right? So jointly non-complying lowers the expected fine. Okay, and that this goes back to the three mechanisms. So one of them could be, for example, that it makes less salient to the regulator that the firms are colluding. So let me skip some slides to get to the estimation. So we assume so we estimate the demand using a BLP model. This kind of standard in the IO literature. So this is going to give us the market the price elasticities, then assuming that price firms competitively, we can also calculate the marginal cost. And using again our proposition, the inequalities that we wrote in the proposition. So we are going to bound the difference between the unilateral non-compliance and jointly non-compliance. So that difference is going to be, has to be higher than the profits from unilateral unilateral non-compliance from unilateral non-compliance, right? So again, we don't know what this EK, what the EK function is. We are totally agnostic about that, but these pi f's we can estimate, right? So we can estimate based on the demand and the supply model what the profits of the firms are like, assuming any level of A. So under any abatement choice of the firms, I can calculate this side, right? And if we calculate this side, then this is going to give me a lower bound on the difference of the EK. And we are going to calculate this precisely this lower bound. Okay, so these are just the demand estimates. I'm going to skip some of the details.
Yeah. Just intuition here, the larger the size of the preferences for trunk space, the costlier will be to comply.
So it depends on the cross elasticities too, right? So because it depends how much. So suppose, so this is your own, so or the A, right? The tank size of a given firm. If you go to non-compliance, if all the other firms minus F are in compliance, right? If you are the only guy that is in non-compliance, minus the profits, your profits, if everybody else is in non-compliance.
Right, but I guess this, for example, I'm thinking of the heterogeneity of those preferences. So trunk space is more important in SUV than in, you know, luxury cars or whatever. So
Right.
in your demand estimates, you hear that, right? That's the point. The abatement here is at the firm level. It's not at the product level.
So it is actually going to be at the product level. Okay. Because remember, like bigger cars need bigger tanks, right? We are going to assume that the dose is so the dose is going to be the compliant dose is going to be the same, 2 or 3%. But every car in reality has a different A.
Right, and consumers might value more or less that attribute in different car models.
Exactly. And also when I said like all cars, it's actually only the working group, so the German firms. So only the German firms are going to be non-compliant, but Ford, that is, I mean, it's not related to this case, it's still going to be in compliance or whatever Ford did, right? Great. I mean, thanks for the question. So this is, and again, like it is an empirical question. What happens, like whether if collusion reduces the expected penalty. Actually, so this is what we find. These are our main findings, like these 4 numbers here. So these 4 numbers are the lower bounds I showed you before. If so for example, let's take 162. So this 162 is what BMW thought or calculated before collusion, that it was going to be its profit difference between unilaterally non-complying and jointly non-complying. So basically, by jointly non-complying or by colluding, BMW earned 162 million euros in expectation, right? So this is the probability times the K, right? So Daimler gained or earned 109, and Volkswagen, it is the largest firm, so it earned almost 300 million euros. And these three numbers sum 571 million euros. Right? So this provides a bound, a lower bound on the difference between so on the benefits in expectation of collusion. So then just very briefly, so why this is the case, so why firms actually benefited from colluding. So you can think that it decreased the inspection probability. So this is what I told you before. So let's look at the graph at BMW. So what we do in this exercise is that we take all the firms to the compliance level, to the 3% compliance level, and this is what the grade distribution looks like, or this is what the grade distribution is, and then we're going to leave BMW as is. So you can see that BMW in this case is an outlier. Kind of so the bad part of this exercise is that we are not going to be able to, we are not able to tell which mechanism, so whether if collusion lowers P or lowers K, which one is the right mechanism. We're just going to provide evidence on which mechanism that the mechanisms are consistent. Right? So you can see that if only one firm non-complies, then we see that that firm is really an outlier. So this first mechanism speaks to that P goes down. Remember, the EK is P times K, right? So this says that the P may go up. Let me tell you, because I think this is interesting, this other exercise. So what we call the distribution of responsibility. So this says that K may go down as well. So what we do here is that we calculated some bounds on what the fine should be for each firm, what the expected fine should be for each firm. So let's take those numbers and suppose that if you as a consumer see that a firm, say Volkswagen, is colluding, or sorry, is in non-compliance, then your willingness to pay for a Volkswagen car goes down, right? Because of their reputation, right? I mean, the K also includes that reputation. Sorry. So then we calculate by how much that willingness to pay of consumers or the utility of consumers should go down, right? So that the firm's profits, each firm's profit goes down precisely in the lower bound, in the bound we calculated before, right? So we do that exercise for each car maker, and then we shock consumers. Sorry, we shock consumers for every car unilaterally. So first, only for BMW cars, or this is the unilateral shock, or for all car makers jointly. Okay, so this is to say every car firm gets this reputation loss separately, or all the car makers get this reputation loss, but jointly. And this is the difference between the two numbers. So these numbers are positive. So they all say that the car makers benefited even if the willingness to pay of consumers went down by the same amount. When they collude, they lose less. Their profits loss is not as big, right? And this is because these car makers, the German car makers, are all seen as substitutes. So when all German car makers, when the willingness to pay for all car makers go down, then consumers don't have where to substitute. All right, so consumers could, if only BMW is affected, then the consumers can substitute, say, to Mercedes-Benz, which is manufactured by Daimler. But if also Mercedes-Benz is shocked, then they have nowhere to go to, so they stick to BMW. Okay, so this is how the effect works. And finally, then we calculate welfare. So what is interesting, as I told you before, is that in this case, both firms and consumers value collusion, value having a lower tank. So both buyer surplus and the profits are going to be higher as a result of collusion, but there are going to be welfare externalities, right? So pollution. So we calculate what those welfare, so what the welfare difference is. And again, this is an empirical question, right? It depends of the willingness to pay, of the profits, and also of how much they pollute it, the car makers pollute it. So this is how what the numbers look like. So let's look at this 3% dosage. So this is under collusion, the willingness to pay of consumers increased, the profits went up of the firms, all the other firms' profits, so think Ford, was kind of indifferent, but we see large health impacts, right? So the sum of all these four columns is actually negative. So this is under the 3% assumption, the welfare loss is is 2.5 billion euros, which is significant, right? It's fairly big. And then in the minute I have left, so let me conclude. So maybe with just a couple of questions to point I kind of alluded to. So this case made us think, right? So when you have innovation or standardization of product attributes versus and when is collusion, right? When firms are actually colluding. So we think that the answer for this is really the welfare impacts. There are some recent papers that look really at the benefits of standardization and how. So, for example, there's a recent paper that looks at the UPC codes. Those were the UPC code was pushed by the industry, not by the regulator, and the welfare consequences of that were humongous, right? And positive. In this case, we found that the welfare consequences were negative. And then the second question is, what are the antitrust implications for innovation? Sort of, I told you earlier briefly that the German car makers work together on lots of different things. So you can think of a seatbelt or the brakes, right? The ABS brakes. So do we really want to stop firms collaborating in all these dimensions? Or we say, okay, I mean, it's fine that they collude on one attribute because as a consequence of this collaboration, we're going to have better brakes, right? Or better seatbelts, right? Safer cars. And I guess, I mean, this is an open question so far. So thank you very much. If you have comments, questions, I mean, I'm happy to hear them now, or you can send me an email later.
No, questions, please, everybody.
Professor Alé-Chilet?
Yes.
Good afternoon. First of all, congratulations on your research. And I've got a question for you. First, and I would like to, it must have been very difficult for regulators to enforce this measure, given that both consumers and firms actually benefit from collusion. So the source of the loss of welfare comes from health, which is very diffuminated not only among people but also across generations. So it must be very difficult for regulators, if you look at the economical policy of this regulation, to actually enforce it. Please, thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a great point, and sadly, it's not something that we can really address, but there are definitely large kind of you can think that more pollution. So for example, you have in some country or a certain city where you have more children, then the welfare losses are going to be higher, right? Because children are more affected by pollution. So it definitely has a distributional impact. So that's a great point. Thanks for that.
כל הכבוד, מורה.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Ronnie, tú estás con...
Disculpe, para no molestar, so not to disturb other people, I turn off the... But my question is, I'm still going back onto the standardization question,
yeah.
Which... suppose, for instance, that they hadn't agreed. Suppose, for instance, that they had agreed on a level that was sufficient to ensure there was no pollution. So suppose they standardize on that level. They say, what we won't accept is somebody to go below that, to have a bigger trunk, and then we will enforce that by accusing him, by going directly to the standards office and accusing him. In that case, and since there's no option for buyers, if all the cars have smaller trunk sizes, well, the buyers have to buy those cars still, because the other companies that are not in the system, if they are compliant, they also have to have smaller trunks. So there's no option for. So that's the part that I don't understand. I see there's an issue with trunks, but if they all collude in the standard so that there's enough abatement, then there's no competitive reason to go out of it.
Right. No, it's a very good point. I would say that in that case, even if there was collusion, so then collusion would be welfare improving, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. Because there is no, I don't know, alternative or suppose that otherwise unilaterally firms would non-comply, but jointly, like they have a mechanism, like a punishment mechanism that makes them all comply. So in that case, we definitely would have a case in which collusion is welfare improving. I'm
missing something there, and it's strange. I understand that what happened in the US is that the companies would fake the results, or would have these mechanisms to fake the results, because they wanted to have some characteristics of the cars still for competitive reasons with other companies, that Japanese companies, for instance. But in Europe, as you were saying, they could all, there was basically no imports basically into Europe, very few. So it's just the European companies. So that's what I find a bit difficult to follow in the argument.
Yeah. So we really think, I mean, and that this is collusion because of the so first because of the mechanisms. So of all this, like of the profit structure. But I agree that there is a fine line between kind of collusion and collaboration, right? So when it's collusion, when it's collaboration. And I think, again, I mean, the difference is on the welfare impacts. So on price, it is clear because consumers lose, right, when firms, as a result of market power. But in other dimensions, it's not that clear. But yeah, it is a point that we should think more. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe a final comment, like, I think your model estimates will be great if you can find or that the optimal penalties, right? Because what are the size of the penalty or the probability, right? You can increase both and play a little bit with those and say, what is the level of penalties that are actually deter this sort of behavior, right? I think that
Yeah.
that would be nice.
So so we would be able to do that like fully if we would take a stance on the EK on the EK function. So if we assume a P, we assume a punishment function, a fine, then we would be able to do that, right? But we think that we are not able to be credible enough if we assume, that function. So instead, what we do is, I didn't tell you about this, but is we calculate this ratio, which is the ratio between the welfare loss, this R, and between the profits of the firms. So think about the firms collude. They earn €1, but the welfare decreases by 1.5 euros, right? So that ratio is going to be 2/3, right? So if the firms then get a fine that is equal to that R, precisely to that R, then this ratio here tells you what is the probability that firms firms attributed to them being caught, and that is around 40%. I think that is the best we can do, right? I mean, given if we want to be agnostic about the EK, we're gathering, impressions of people to see how they react to this, or if they push us really to assume EK, and then really to calculate like the consequences of this and to estimate the optimal fine. But so far we think that we cannot credibly do that.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thanks Jorge, great talk, and yeah, we definitely stay in touch. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great afternoon, professors.
Thank you.